Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Holly. I'm a museum manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And this month we're talking about women's suffragists, and I am joining with some of them, probably about 110 years ago or so. Before we get any further into our PowerPoint, I just wanted to read you from a book called Seduced by the Light, and it talks a little bit about Mina Miller Edison's views on women's suffrage. This is Thomas Edison's second wife. His first wife passed away at a young age, and they will have children together, both marriages. But I just wanted to share a little bit about Edison's views. Women's suffrage was another topic that troubled the traditional Mrs. Edison. Not only was it a widespread issue that yielded debate, but it sold newspapers. Mina unabashedly stated that women are not interested in political problems. Wait and then come to us. Then the American man will see that what she she asked for reasonably. I'll just leave that there. So I think you probably get an idea of what her views were at the time. She was definitely a little bit of more of a traditional thinker. Edison did believe women should have the right to vote. The suffrage movement. And when I wrote that, I realized I should have said women's suffrage because suffrage means the right to vote. But I kind of defaulted to that. It was the more accepted use of it. And here's some women in Ohio in 1912. Come and learn why women ought to vote. And these women were tireless, and it passes from one generation to the next because it took such a long time. Suffrage means the right to vote. In July of 1848, and when you find out the date that they actually get the right to vote, you'll see this is a long struggle. The first women's rights convention was organized in Seneca Falls, New York. Female Quakers from the area organized the meeting along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was not a Quaker. And she was a pretty well-known name at the time in the women's right movement. They planned the event during a visit to the area by Philadelphia-based Lucretia Mott, also very well known at the time. Mott, a Quaker, was famous for her speaking ability, which was rare for non-Quaker meeting during an era in which women were often not allowed to speak in public. That would have been a problem for me. The convention developed a list of demands that it called the Declaration of Sentiments. Based on the Declaration of Independence, it called for greater educational and professional opportunities for women and for married women to control their own income and property because they were controlled by their husbands at the time. After this historic gathering, women's voting rights became a central issue in the emerging debate about women's rights in the United States. And these are the people that signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a very kind of considered kind of a very controversial, very supportive women's rights. So there was a lot of women, but it wasn't just women. It was also men, and you can see the signatures there. And there's the Declaration of Sentiments. And if you want to Google that, you can read the whole thing. I thought it was pretty impressive. Many of the attendees at the convention were also abolitionists whose goals included universal suffrage, the right to vote for all adults. So not just for women, but also for all adults, men and women of both white and black. In 1870, this goal was partially realized when the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, granting Black men the right to vote, was ratified. Now, you wouldn't think this would be controversial, but it was. Some women's suffragists vehemently disagreed over supporting the 15th Amendment. This resulted in a split in the women's suffrage movement into two new suffrage organizations that focused on different strategies to win women the right to vote. So we're going to have one group that thinks unless everyone is getting the right to vote, then we cannot support this amendment. And you can listen to what they say and think about what side you would have come down on. Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Brown Backwell, teamed up with other prominent reformers, including lecturer and author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Julia Ward Howe, writer Mary Livermore, and the famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher, related to somebody else quite well-known, Harriet Beecher Stowe, to create the American Women's Suffrage, AWSA, which was headquartered in Boston, the city known as the center of reform movements such as abolitionism. In 1870, Stone established the Woman's Journal, which quickly became a successful suffrage newspaper. The paper announced and recapped the association's meetings, discussed suffrage issues, and detailed strategies. The Woman's Journal lasted beyond the end of the suffrage movement, ending publication in 1931. And this is, it did continue for a while. So this shows Margaret Foley, who was active in the suffrage movement later on, distributing it. The AWSA soon became the more popular organization because it was more moderate in its goals. While the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, advocated for a range of reforms to make women equal members of society, AWSA focused only on the vote to attract as many supporters as possible. So the NWSA wanted to focus on all women's rights, not just voting, where AWSA just wanted to focus on voting. And so there is a split in their goals, which is a shame because I think there's strength in numbers, but maybe it worked out the way it was supposed to. AWSA also included well-known male reformers among its leaders and members. AWSA focused on gaining women's access to the polls at state and local levels, believing that victories there would achieve support for national action, while a federal women's suffrage amendment was not their priority. So they're going for the smaller things, getting their rights to vote by state, one state at a time, where NWSA is also, they're trying to get it at a federal level. There was an amendment, a 1971 petition asking women in DC, it wasn't an amendment, it was a petition, and their territories being allowed to vote and hold office from AWSA leadership to Congress shows its support. But it's still, there was still that division. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other prominent women's rights leaders addressed this December 1871 petition to the Senate and House of Representatives. They asked Congress to pass a law giving women the right to vote. So this would be the NWSA. They also asked to speak before both houses of Congress about this issue. Stanton and Anthony had formed the NWSA in May of 1869. This group opposed the 15th Amendment that granted Black men the right to vote, not because they weren't in favor of that, but because it excluded women and they thought all people deserved the right to vote. In the year after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, the NWSA sent this voting rights petition to Congress. Susan B. Anthony, there she is, registered and voted in the 1872 election in Rochester, New York. And as she predicted, she was arrested for knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting for a representative to Congress of the United States. Can you imagine that? They arrested her. The state of New York convicted her and fined her $100, which she insisted she would never pay. And I don't know the answer to if she ever did. On January 12th, 1874, Anthony petitioned Congress requesting that the fine imposed upon your petitioner be remitted as an expression of the sense of this high tribunal that her conviction was unjust. Congress considered bills to remit the fine, but they never took any action. Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved leader of the abolition movement, also was an advocate for women attaining the right to vote, as were his family. A number of Black women actively supported women's suffrage during this time. They organized women's clubs across the country to advocate for suffrage, along with other reforms. Prominent African American suffragists included Ida B. Wells Barnett of South Carolina, of Chicago. There she is right there, a leading crusader against lynching. And there's Frederick Douglass. Mary Churchill Terrell, educator and first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and Adela Hunt Logan, Tuskegee Institute faculty member who insisted in articles in The Crisis, a publication of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, that if white women needed the vote to protect their rights, then Black women, victims of racism as well as sexism, needed the ballot even more. And that came from our federal archives, that information, as well as their pictures. So even though white women and Black women are fighting for these rights, we'll see what happens. And let me move myself over here. There's a memorial to Congress from the Women's Suffrage Association in 1872. The National Women's Suffrage Association, as I mentioned, opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. The American Women's Suffrage Association supported the amendment and protested the confrontational tactics of the NWSA. So that was another cause for their division. They were much more aggressive, much more outspoken. And there's something from the American Women's Suffrage Association, respectfully praise your honorable bodies to enact a law and authorizing women who are citizens of the United States and the District of Columbia and all other territories to vote and hold office when the same terms and conditions as men. Also, that you will take such additional steps as necessary by amending the federal constitution or otherwise to protect political distinctions on account of sex anywhere throughout the United States. This memorial is presented in accordance with resolution adopted at the last annual meeting of the said American Women's Suffrage Association. And it continues from there. In 1910, suffragists began organizing large parades to draw attention to the cause of suffrage. So remember when this started? This is 1846. We're already all the way up to 1910. And if I had the time, I could have gone in a lot more detail. It was a very long fight. They organized parades to draw attention to the cause of suffrage. One of the most important demonstrations was a parade held in D.C. on March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's first presidential inauguration. More than 5,000 suffragists from around the country paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue from the U.S. Capitol to the Treasury Building. And there they are. It set a model for future marches, but was also controversial. It was a peaceful march by the women, by the way. According to the National American Women's Suffrage, all people were welcome to march. However, here's the caveat, and this is the more controversial of the two, the more aggressive, NAWSA. Alice Paul tried to exclude Black women from participating because she was afraid white women would not march beside them. So much for equal rights for everyone, huh? I was really disappointed by this. Ultimately, NAWSA forced Paul to allow Black women, to join the march. Ridiculous that wasn't supposed to happen at first. Some women of color, such as civil rights crusader Ida B. Wells Barnett and lawyer Marie Louise Boatno Baldwin, a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, resisted the attempt to racially segregate the parade by walking alongside white women. That screams of hypocrisy to me, that they were not, some of them were not going to allow that to happen. Obviously, some of them did, and it did happen, but it wasn't easy. Here's something else that went on at this peaceful march. The unruly, mostly male crowd watching the parade moved closer to the marchers, leaving barely enough room for them to get by. Many women were verbally and physically assaulted in a peaceful march while police stood by. But we know this happens in history onward and onward in the civil rights movement. Peaceful protests, violent results from the people that are police or people that are supposed to be protecting the rights of others. So the police stood by, either unwilling or unable to control the crowd. Outrage over the violence resulted in a congressional investigation into the lack of police protection for the marchers and increased sympathy for women's suffrage. After the U.S. entered the war, I'm talking about World War I, American suffragists felt that if America was defending democracy abroad, women deserved it at home in votes for women. In 1917, a small group of militant suffragists led by Alice Paul began picketing outside the White House, pressing President Wilson to support a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. Calling themselves the Silent Sentinels, a rotating group of women stood by the White House gates for months. They carried signs intended to confront and embarrass Wilson. So there they are, again, another peaceful protest, but they are considered militants. They're picketing, they're not violent, but they're there every day. Well, at first, Wilson seemed bemused by the picketers. He tipped his hat and smiled. He even invited them in for coffee. But as time went on, his attitude changed. In late June 1917, 6 women were arrested. 11 more were retained on July 4th. 10 days later, a third group was taken into custody. All the women were charged with obstructing traffic. The protesters were sentenced to 60 days in the workhouse. There they suffered beatings, force feedings. I meant to put a picture in of a woman being force fed because they were protesting their incarceration, so they were not eating, and unsanitary conditions. But the pickets and the arrests continued. And the president could have stopped them, by the way. In August, scuffles broke out by the gates. For 3 days, suffragists were dragged, punched, and choked by angry crowds, and city police stood by, refusing to help, as these women peacefully protested. Wilson was repelled by the militant suffragists outside his gate. To him, their methods were insulting, unfeminine, and unpatriotic. I'm not talking about that they were committing any violence, the women's, but there were other suffrage supporters who shunned confrontational tactics. You know, these women were speaking out, maybe shouting, trying to get attention. This group, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, embraced the war as an opportunity for women to earn the vote through their patriotism. So 2 different tactics, much more laid back by the one, but neither one were aggressive. They did not commit violence. On the eve of congressional vote on the women's suffrage amendment, Catt made a personal plea to the president. Her appeal worked. Addressing the Senate, Wilson finally spoke out in favor of the suffrage amendment. But guess what? It was to no avail. The Senate rejected women's suffrage by 2 votes. The 19th Amendment would have to wait. And I'll tell you when it happens shortly. In 1890, finally, NWSA and AWSA merged to become this group together. Now, but you're going to say to me, but you're talking about militant suffragists. Yes, but they were still, when they become one group, There's still people that are going to always be more aggressive. People are going to be more laid back. So even though they joined together, they still had different tacks. It was a work in progress, but it did become the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the largest women's suffrage organization in the country. And they led much of the struggle for the right to vote. So they are one group, but they still are kind of have some divisions in it. So the American women and the NWSA, you can still see that little divide until eventually they unite together. When they led the struggle for the vote, though, as a group, trying to get those differences behind them when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Stanton became its president, Anthony vice president, and Stone became the chairperson of the executive committee. In 1919, NAWSA reorganized into the League of Women Voters, and they still exist today. Very active politically. Helen Hamilton Gardner, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Maud Wood Park on the balcony of the Suffrage House, the Washington headquarters of the National American Women Suffrage Association. Women's suffrage. Full universal suffrage is granted through a constitutional amendment and ensures women's right to vote in all types of elections, including presidentials. Partial women's suffrage is granted through legislative acts and gives partial or limited voting to women on matters of school, taxes, and bond issues. Sometimes women had to own property. So there's some of this is granted in 1869 in Wyoming, the first state, 1893 Colorado, 1896 Idaho, 1910 Washington, 1911 California, 1912 Arizona, 1912 Kansas, 1912 Oregon, 1914 Montana, 1914 Nevada, 1917 New York, 1918 Michigan, 1918 Oklahoma, 1918 South Dakota. So this is what at state level, but not at the federal level yet. But before we go on with that, let's talk a little more. Let's talk about other countries as well. Though my focus is on the suffrage movement in the United States, I thought you might be interested in a little bit. This is a stamp from Australia. Although some other territories enfranchised women before 1893, New Zealand was the first self-governing country to grant the vote to all adult women, because I kind of thought you'd like to hear where we fall in this list. Female descendants of the Bounty mutineers were allowed to vote for their ruling councils on the Pitcairn Island beginning in 1838. And on Norfolk Island after 1856, the Isle of Man, the self-governing dependent colony of the British Crown, enfranchised women in 1881. Women in the Cook Islands, then a British protectorate, I didn't say that right, were allowed to participate in elections for island councils and federal parliament from 1893. This law was enacted several days after the New Zealand Electoral Act, but Cook Island women voted first on October 14th. Australia quickly followed New Zealand. Australia enfranchised women in 1894. Western Australia, 1899. They seem very liberated here. And Australian Commonwealth government followed in 1902. But here's the little pinch from that, except for Indigenous Australian women. So they still had a ways to go. And you know what I learned? I kind of had found this out a little while ago, but I always thought suffragist and suffragette were the same thing. But they really weren't. What happened? Suffragette, I'm just going to briefly talk about the other very strong movement. This is over in the UK, Great Britain. Suffragette was originally used as a sexist insult, and then we'll get back to the US. It was first devised in January of 1906 by a British Daily Mail reporter covering the Women's Social and Political Union. in their militant demonstrations, and I am talking militant, to gain the right to vote. Demeaning and mocking the demonstrators, the mailed reporter used the feminized play on the word suffragist, which refers to a person's advocacy to expand by voting rights. The label implied that the movement for women's suffrage was not genuine or to be ridiculed, historian Nancy Rohr wrote in Time. The movement was something less than the real thing, as in a small kitchen became a kitchenette. Et is an insult and demeaning to women. British women, though, reclaimed the word suffragette for the movement, and as their brand, the WSPU named their magazine the Suffragette in 1912, so they're turning it around. They pronounced it with a hard G, like suffragette. So there, reflecting this in 1914, the publication included a note writing, "We have all heard of the girl who asked what the difference was between a suffragist and a suffragette, as she pronounced it, and the answer made sense to her, that the suffragist just wants the vote, while the suffragette means to get it." So that's how they pronounced it. In the United States, however, the term was more often used by the anti-suffragist, people that are against suffragists, rather than the activists themselves. Suffragette is a loaded term. American suffragists never used it, only their detractors. The word is still used as an overall term for mostly white women who fought for the right to vote. And this is Mrs. Pankhurst. You're going to see her picture again. The British movement gets much more aggressive, maybe even, well, definitely it's a few times resorting to violence. It began in 1897 when the National Union of Women's Suffrage was founded by Millicent Fawcett. Unlike some of her peers, Fawcett thought the best approach to get the women to vote for women was through peaceful protest, not violence. So there were philosophical differences in the United States between those two groups, but it was how they demonstrated, how they approached it, and it never went to the level of physical violence. That was only done against them. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and others, frustrated by the lack of progress, decided more forceful action was required and founded the Women's Social and Political Union with the motto, "Deeds, not words." Oh, and I forgot to talk about the motto in the United States, which was "Votes for Women," but theirs is "Deeds, not words." Emmeline Pankhurst became involved in women's suffrage in 1880. She was the founding member of WPSU, membership limited to women only, in 1903, and led it till it ended in 1918. Under her leadership, the WPSU was a very organized group, and like other members, she was in prison and went on hunger strike protests. WPSU members were determined to obtain the right to vote for women by any means and campaigned tirelessly and sometimes violently, to be quite honest, to achieve this aim. There were some explosions here and there. They felt that the impact of peaceful tactics seemed to have been exhausted and a different, more radical approach was needed. At first, the WSPU's tactics were to cause disruption and some civil disobedience. However, the lack of government action led the WPSU to commence more violent acts, including attacks on property and law breaking, which resulted in imprisonment and hunger strikes. Now, remember, the women in the U.S. in their peaceful march were put in jail for that. These tactics attracted a lot of attention to the campaign for votes for women. And do you want to know when they got the right to vote in Britain? Well, it started in 1917. In the UK, married women, female householders, and female university graduates, that's at least their age 30s, that started in 1917. So just give you a little taste. I mean, in the movie, if I kept on going, I could tell you, let's see, Spain until 1931, full suffrage in the UK was until 1928, France not till 1944, Ecuador 1946, Argentina 1947, 1954 Belize, 1957 Colombia and Singapore, 1958 Iraq, 1964, Afghanistan. 1965, South Africa. And 1984, Jordan, Liberia, and Liechtenstein. And there's even ones beyond that. So while we weren't at the top, we weren't at the bottom either, but it did take a long time. And this was passed by Congress June 4th, 1919. The 66th Congress of the United States of America at the first session begun and held at the city of Washington on Monday, the 19th day of May, 1019 and 119, joint resolution proposing an amendment to the Constitution extending the right of suffrage to women, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, 2/3 of each house, and concurring therein, that the following article is proposed as an amendment to the Constitution, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislature of 3/4, 75% of the several states, the United States. So they voted in favor of it, but it still needed to be ratified by 75% of the states. The rights, and they didn't put the article number in there. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So during that time, this is not without controversy, lots of editorials, lots of political cartoons. I don't know if you can see what this one says. It says votes for women, and it says back sometime this evening. That's supposed to be the man's wife, the children's mother. There's one reaching out her hands. There's a child crying. This is what's happening at home. So kind of an underhanded, dirty political cartoon. And here's one still trying to button it up. I think this is in 1919, perhaps. It's that 36 button, Samuel, and it says national suffrage. They were stuck. They needed another state to vote, to ratify it so that they could get the right to vote. What happens? When the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, all white and Black women were granted the right to vote. In the next decade, several Southern states passed laws to stop most Black women from voting. The 19th Amendment did not cover groups of women such as Native Americans. It wasn't until 1924 that all Native Americans who had been born in the United States were granted citizenship. Isn't that crazy? But many Native Americans could not vote because there were state laws that restricted them. In 1948, all Native Americans received the right to vote. Some states delayed until 1957. The ratification did not mean that all American women gained the right to vote. Immediately in 1920, many barriers to voting remained for Black women, Native American and Indigenous women, Asian American women, and Latinx women. Black women and men's voting rights would not be incorporated into the country's law until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there were so many underhanded things done by individual states. Some states did not ratify the amendment until as recently as the 1970s and 1980s, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. 11 states ratified it after it had already been certified in 1920. It would be 50 years before South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana would ratify, with Mississippi becoming the last to join. In 1984, in Virginia, which ratified in 1852, the Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage distributed pamphlets that argued that the vote of women would have a negative effect on the everyday lives of women, that it was the vanguard of socialism, and that it would undermine the role of husbands in the family. In Alabama, which ratified in 1953, the Women's Anti-Ratification League stated that the idea that Alabama women should be more concerned about raising families and participation in civic life. And in Florida, which ratified in 1969, Florida, opposition from newspapers and politicians to suffrage was intense. Yes, Tennessee did become that 36th state to ratify it. But there's so many barriers. I wanted to read something. The biggest lesson for me from the suffrage movement is that you need to fight to win the war, not the battle, says Sally Ross Wagner, historian, author, and editor of the Women's Suffrage Movement Anthology. There is some irony in the Southern resistance of suffrage, as Wagner points out. The white suffragists, who were the facts of the movement in 1920, had devoted much of their energy in winning over the votes of Southern states, including those who initially refused to ratify. In doing so, they sold out the movement, she said, by using racism as an organizational policy. When states ratified the 19th Amendment well after 1920, it was more of a ceremonial gesture, but one that carried great symbolism. It was an all-male Senate that voted on Mississippi's ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1984, which was called a housekeeping measure, yet it was introduced by two female state representatives, Frances Savage of Brandon and Margaret Tate of Picayune. On its ratifications, Savage suggested that the reason for the delay that it was simply not a priority during the years of the Depression, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. But by then it once again risen to the top when Mississippi was debating the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. I can't even imagine that it took that long, and all the prejudice that not only, women still didn't have that complete right to vote someplace, but all the prejudice that held back women of color. So when I was in Tennessee, I've been there a few times, but when I was in Nashville, and I was walking down the street and I saw this sign, thought it was really interesting. August 18th, on August 8th, votes for women. There's the motto. August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, thereby giving all American women the right to vote. Unfortunately, they really all didn't get it. But you get the idea. After weeks of intense lobbying by the national leaders, Tennessee passed the measure by one vote. The headquarters for both suffragists wearing yellow roses and anti-suffragists wearing red were in the Hermitage Hotel. So yes, women won the right to vote, but we held back our sisters because of prejudice. And yes, women across the country, at least white women, unfortunately, not always women of color, were able to vote, but that even for a ceremonial or for a statement that it took that long for some states to ratify it was ridiculous. The 19th Amendment legally guaranteed American women the right to vote. By 1916, all major suffrage organizations were united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment. When New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917 and President Wilson changed his support to amendment in 1918, the political balance began to shift. On May 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed, and Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify it and I read that, on August 18th, 1920, when it passed its final obstacle of obtaining the ratification of 3/4, not 2/3, but 3/4. The ratification was certified on August 26, 1920, and it changed American elections forever. The campaign for suffrage was long, arduous, and sometimes dangerous, but ratification did not ensure the full right to vote. Some women had full voting rights, while others can only vote in school board elections, and millions of others had no voting rights at all. Even after the 19th Amendment ratification in 1920, Asian women, Black, Latina women, and Native American women faced obstacles to voting through the 1960s because of discriminatory practices and intimidation. After the 1920 election, women from the suffrage movement set off in different directions. One of those was the Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal rights under the law and prohibiting discrimination on account of sex, first introduced to Congress in 1923. And this says, put your mother in the Constitution. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by the Senate on account of any of sex. And there's Phyllis Schlafly in 1972. She spoke out against the ERA and women's rights. She was an anti-women's libber. This is Bella Abzug, the one with the hats from New York, that's speaking out in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. And I didn't realize how far back this went. One of those is the ERA, and that went back to 1923, guaranteeing equal rights under the law and prohibiting discrimination on account of sex, first introduced in 1923. And by the way, as a teenager, I remember the ERA in 1972 coming back again and hoping that there would be enough states to ratify it. And by the way, this is a statue that's in Nashville in Centennial Park with the 5 women in that state who worked very hard to get women the right to vote, get that 36th state to ratify. Those were their local heroes. And they did this, I think, in 2016. They raised over $1 million privately to have this statue raised to the women that fought. And I talked about the League of Women Voters, which still remains today active in elections. But the ERA, that never went anywhere. Believe it or not, the Equal Rights Amendment split the women's movement as it was opposed by labor and social welfare leaders who feared that even as it guaranteed equal rights under the law, its adoption would erase hard-won protective regulations for women in the workplace. Can you imagine equal rights for women? It was controversial. Some of the women in the movement opposed the ERA, including the League of Women Voters, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the New Dealers. And without unified support, the ERA floundered in Congress even larger than women's suffrage, 49 years. It was finally passed by Congress in 1972, but met stiff resistance in states from social and religious conservatives, led by Republican activists. And I showed you her picture, Phyllis Schlafly. And they deployed some of the same arguments that the anti-suffragists had used, warning that the ERA would upset gender roles, endanger the home and family, subjecting women to a range of perils 6 decades before. And Schlafly gleefully debated the ERA with women's libbers, and it's never been ratified. And under public pressure, 5 states, including Tennessee, actually rescinded. Darn it, Tennessee, look at that statue, and then you did that. Their original ratification. And even after a decade of trying, the ERA continues to be introduced in each new Congress in hopes of eventual passage and ratification. But the women splintered during that time after they won the right to vote. Well, they won the right to vote for some women. The League of Women Voters is still active in every state, and it's educating its citizens and making democracy work as it has gone past its 100th anniversary. So it still continues. And on the 96th anniversary of the 19th Amendment's entry into the Constitution, August 26, 2016, more than 400 people gathered in the Centennial Park. The women's suffrage movement, a small group of Tennessee women that called themselves the Perfect 36, had toiled for years on this, maneuvering around skeptical legislatures and hostile bureaucrats, raising almost $1 million to commission a statue for Minot sculpture. And that's the 5 heroes, the Tennessee suffrage Suffs, they were called: Sue White, Ann Dudley, Abby Milton, and Frankie, and a national leader, Carrie Catt. They're slightly larger than life, dressed in fashion, draped in sashes, hoisting banners. And some of the members, their family members, were there, and some political people, and mothers brought daughters. People from Tennessee, black and white, all stood there to honor the statue for the women that fought for fought for votes for all women. And let's hope going forward that all women have equal treatment under the law, that all women and all men and everyone has a right to vote if they're a citizen of the United States. So if you go to Nashville, check out this statue, see these women, and to every state that ratified the initial 36, thank you. It took a very long time. We're talking almost 80 years to get this done. The ERA, that still continues. Well, my final thing I'm going to say is that there's a musical out there. I was on Facebook and this popped up as I'm researching women's suffragists. Coincidence? Probably not. So I looked this up, and I used to follow the Tony Awards, which are the Broadway awards, and I had a vague memory that this won a couple of awards. Suffs is a musical. That was the nickname for them, with music, lyrics, and a book. But Shanata, based on suffragists and the American women's suffrage movement, focusing primarily on the historical events leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1920 that gave some women, primarily white women, the right to vote. As we've discussed, the show premiered off-Broadway at the Public Theater in April 2022. It opened on Broadway on April 18th, 2024 at the Music Box Theater, where it received mostly positive reviews. Not so much off-Broadway, but Broadway, it was greatly improved. It was nominated for 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, and it won 2, Best Book and Best Score. And unfortunately, I think it's January 5th or 6th. It's not going to remain on Broadway and never got the support that it needed, but they are going to have a national touring company, which is the equivalent of Broadway, except it goes on the road. So let's hope it comes to Barbara Mann here in Fort Myers, because I would love to hear it and see it. And that this fight, and I think it shows women, warts and all, with all the mistakes and divisions, but the fight for women to win the right to vote. If you're interested, I can send you my sources: Smithsonian History, Smithsonian Magazine, Time, The Women's Hour, and I actually read some other books too. I just didn't get to use it all on here. And under chat, I have great presentation. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. So if you get to see Suffs, go see it. Do a little research about the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and perhaps even about the ERA. I thank you so much for your support and joining me. So I hope you'll tell your friends. Thank you. I learned a lot. I hope you did. Bye-bye.